Getting out of an abusive relationship early makes a huge difference.
And I'm proud to say I did come in as a victim, but I am a survivor.
Then I could see my mom. My mom was walking toward us. And I got excited. And I was like, there's my mom. And then he didn't stop.
I'm trying to keep it together, I said. I gave in to the tears. And I hated that.
It's not necessarily the easiest process. It's not necessarily the prettiest process, but it is the most effective process. Like, you can do this. I'm going to tell you 100% you can do this, and you're so worth it to do this.
I'm sure losing any child is a real arrow through your heart, but you know, she was great. She was a friend and a family member and our daughter.
It feels just as good the 10th time as it did the first time to have one of your citizens that you're out there protecting walk up and tell you thank you.
There is one thing stronger in me than fear, and that's my determination.
This is Jen Lee, the creator and host of I Need Blue, Survivors Talk Surviving. Visit www.ineedblue.net for additional stories. Today, I would like to introduce a special guest, Alan P. Smith. He is a clinical social worker which provides mental health therapy. He's been working over 30 years with trauma victims. He is here today to share insights and treatment considerations. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I appreciate that. And you are so welcome. I appreciate the opportunity to increase awareness and empathy for victims of violent crime. And I just want to acknowledge the courage it takes for you to share your story.
Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. The healing process can be very difficult. This topic of trauma, it's so vast and so many facets, but I think as a therapist, kind of walk you through treatment and how the healing process begins. And in that will illuminate a lot of issues that come up with victims. I think you were very right to say, Jen, that not everybody will go through every one of these, but I think it's important to kind of illuminate many of the different ways various victims go through. I need to say at this point, though, this is for informational purposes only. Nothing really takes the place of a therapist's office. I highly encourage any victim out there that is contemplating therapy to go into therapy. It really is a beneficial thing and definitely something I've devoted 30 plus years doing.
Sometimes taking that first step to go to therapy can seem really hard. I don't think therapy is meant to be easy. It's meant to actually help you look inside and really understand what you're feeling, learn what your triggers are, and then learn how to deal with them in a healthy way.
The first question I get a lot is why therapy? Because it doesn't change anything. You can talk all day long about what happened to you. I acknowledge that to a client sometimes it's very hesitant to come into treatment. What we've learned, and I am no neurologist, I don't play one on TV or anything like that, but I do know some basics that I've learned in a lot of anxiety and post-traumatic stress disordered conferences I've been to. Trauma gets stored in your right brain, and they've done these incredible MRIs. I don't know how they do it, but they can tell the way your mind is connected. And what we discovered as people just simply talked about what happened to them, it started to integrate. The brain looked different before and after treatment, that it didn't show up as just being stored in the right brain. It's really fascinating what they've discovered. It's amazing how helpful it is, just simply telling your story or finding any way to tell it, whether it's to a therapist, in a journal, if you don't feel comfortable talking with someone, or a close friend, whoever that may be. It definitely helps integrate your brain and help the beginning of the healing process. The second part of treatment is I try to normalize the experience. Now, it's very easy to feel like you're losing control.
Yeah.
I mean, that's normal for a victim. I mean, it's not normal prior to the traumatic incident. It's almost like a forced new normal you have to go through, and it's very disconcerting to people. But I try to walk them through each and every one of them, why it's happening, and I'll go into that further. Because your mind, when it goes through a traumatic event, when you think of your five senses, it catalogs everything during the traumatic incident. And whether or not you're even aware of all this as you're going through the trauma, it gets cataloged in your mind.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why the weirdest and strangest things, like it could be some elevator music song from back in the 70s, some disco song that you hear. It's not even the original version of it, but you hear it and all of a sudden you're terrified. You know, when you go through things like that, it's very, very disconcerting to people. I try to let them know that this is normal, that your mind is trying to protect you. It's like casting a wide net to make sure that, oh, that was a sound that was during that traumatic incident. Oh, this could happen again. Again, this is not happening consciously, but subconsciously. I try to get very specific with my clients in terms of all the different triggers that they're feeling, and also be ready for some ones that you're not even aware of yourself. In your particular case, Jen, having to go back to the place that you were traumatized within, you just say 10 days or 2 weeks?
Yeah, 10 days I was trying to go back to work.
Yeah, like think about it if you had a horrific plane ride, and then 10 days later, somebody forces you to get back on the plane. But you had to because that was your job, and I don't know if they're going to replace you then and there, but it's a business and there's a certain kind of thing that you have to do in the flow of life. And it's not always that common that you have to revisit that quickly the place and that you were traumatized in. There's some basic kind of things I'll start to go over. And again, these don't have to fit everyone, but I think it's a very good, decent list to kind of start with in terms of a trigger or common things that happen to victims is they feel a complete loss of control, especially in a victim of violent crime. In that, you can lose your ability to think or reason. The studies say most people in those type of situations just panic. They freeze. They don't know what to do. There's a lot of guilt involved with that with a lot of the victims. Like they wish they would have done more, stuck up more, wish they would have said things differently, but no one knows what they're going to be like until they have a gun in their face, you know, and it's the most terrifying, one of the most terrifying experiences we go through.
Yeah.
You know,
I was asked basically exactly what you just talked about, going through the thought process of, oh my gosh, what could I have done differently? But interestingly enough, for my situation, that wasn't the question that I dealt with. The question for me is what could have happened. That haunted me because there was a point we walked past the bathrooms and I was the last one. I was like, oh my gosh, he could have pulled me in there and raped me. There are so many what ifs that could have happened in that situation. And it was dealing with that. I had to figure out how to kind of cope with that. So it might be a little bit, maybe you have the what if situation, or maybe you also dealt with, I could have done this different. Again, everybody is different. I know my one assistant manager was like, oh my God, if it was me, I would have passed out. But interestingly enough, you really don't know because it's much easier to be on the outside thinking, oh, this is what I would do. But in reality, it could be totally different.
You know, another part of this too is to be very self-critical. You know, you're trying to go over all the what if possibilities. And even afterwards, you know, you almost tend to try to be perfect. You're trying to keep yourself as safe as possible and put unrealistic expectations of yourself to that, because the reality of it is, and it's very difficult, you know, part of the job I do as a therapist to help people deal with reality. But the reality is this could happen again. Not to, you know, make you nervous or anything, you know, and that's what makes it difficult for your mind to relax and say, geez, it's okay. Hey, one bad thing happened. I've done my quota. It shouldn't happen again. But it's possible. Mm-hmm. And, you know, watching the news and everything that goes on in this world, you know, you get reinforcements of that. It's hard to kind of avoid, you know, gun problems and violence and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, and I think once it happens to you, you have more of a realization that, okay, don't ever say it can't happen to you, because the reality is it can. It was just a normal day of work for me. Got dressed, got in my car, drove to work, and thought I was just going to make sales. And it ended up in a totally different situation. So I always say, don't live in a world of it can't happen to you, because it can. Not that I want to scare you, but it's always good to be aware of your surroundings.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's the key to, probably skipping ahead a little bit, but that's okay. I don't mind. But that's definitely one of the keys to healing, is accepting this new normal, that you need to have more awareness. I think in general, most people need more awareness. You know, it's difficult. It's hard to face it as a new normal, but it's part of the process of healing and being prepared. The more your mind thinks you're prepared, you can't prepare for everything. I don't give false hope to people and that type of thing. But I think the more prepared you are, the less anxiety people tend to feel over a lifetime or over the course of time, you know. Other typical things are denial, shock. It's almost like the typical stages, and these aren't the perfect set of typical stages that you deal with a loss, but they tend to glide right into victims too, where denial, shock, anger, bargaining or trying to make sense of it, and then finally acceptance. And that's very fluid, by the way. You know, you could go back to, because you have a trigger, you're back to denial and shock, or you're back to anger. But those 5 stages tend to work fairly well with victims of trauma in general. So just to kind of throw that out in terms of, you know, the healing process of what you go through.
Yeah, well, and if I might add, and I think I actually told you this in a previous conversation, when I first started dating my husband, he used to talk from me from behind. And I heard the robber's voice behind me. And then when I turned around, that's when I had the gun pointed at me. But when my husband used to kind of talk to me, not that he was yelling to get my attention, but just the fact that that voice was behind me, immediately fear and then anger. And I would turn around and I very gently would be like, babe, I can't have you talk to me like that, because it's making me really angry and I know you don't understand. And so it took me explaining that to him a few times, but he gets it. And I think I'm more comfortable now with voices behind me because it's been so long. But yeah, I mean, that was just a few years ago and that trigger was still inside me.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. The startle response.
Yeah.
Because again, you're talking about your fight or flight. This was, you know, especially with violent crimes, you're facing your mortality.
Yeah.
And that's not the easiest thing to do. And so your fight or flight is triggered. And your fight or flight is, you know, if you're walking across the street and a car's coming at you, you don't want to be thinking for the next 25 minutes what to do, right? You want massive energy and get the heck out of there. So when your fight or flight is triggered after a traumatic incident, it's very, very difficult to turn that off. So you have this heightened level of awareness, you know, kind of almost typical with post-traumatic stress disorder. You're keenly aware of everything. You know, you can re-experience the event in your mind in different ways, sometimes even through nightmares also, daydreaming, like your whole shift is toward that traumatic event. And this is normal. Not easy. I don't think I've said the word easy yet, right?
Yeah, no, it's not easy.
But I feel the best approach with victims is like with everybody else. You talk to them straight. You let them know everything that might be going on, so there's as least surprises as possible. So when these things start to happen, and I'll go over even more factors, they're going to be prepared. They're going to understand it. It's so easy to slip into, oh my God, am I losing control again? Am I crazy? You know? And I use the word crazy not in the traditional sense like a therapist would, but just you feel like everything is so surreal.
Yeah.
Like it just, nothing is the same as it was before.
Well, and I think what I'll add is a lot of times I would ask myself, why me? I don't think that there is an answer to that. It is nothing personal against me. I think it's best that you don't blame yourself. Don't take any blame for it. I think that asking yourself why me is just a normal process of the whole healing process.
Yes, exactly. And it's, like you said, completely normal way to think. And I'll get to this a little bit later in the podcast, but I'm very scientific about those questions, you know, like why me? Then you look at the statistics, you know, the possibilities not only of of things happening, but the potential for things to happen again. And you try to come up with as many thoughts as you can about that, of why it wasn't you, that's reasonable. And I work very closely with the client on that. But I'll get to that more later, but definitely part of the healing process. You covered the one already. You're doing a good job. You're doing half my work here, Jen.
Oh, no problem.
Your mind races over all the possibilities. This is normal. To have an obsession with feeling safe. I'm going to use the word paranoia, but it's not really paranoia because this could happen again. And, but you're more suspicious of everything. You don't take anything for granted. Before you walk out, you're thinking a lot more thoughts than you used to before you walked out, And I find in working with victims, one of the hardest things for them to deal with is how hard they are on themselves. Like, why am I thinking this? What's wrong with me? And the earlier I can get to that type of thinking and allow them to be a little easier on themselves, this is more normal, you're not doing anything wrong, the easier it is. Because in the long run, I think having those doubts about yourself becomes bigger than the trauma itself sometimes.
Yeah.
People can become totally encapsulated in beating themselves up, to be very, to hurting themselves. And, some victims can turn to alcohol and drugs or watching too much TV or gambling. There's a lot of things that can eventually lead to if it's not kind of gotten to.
I'm going to switch gears on you, so don't get mad.
No, that's all right. Go ahead.
I did a survey on one of our local neighborhood apps because I really wanted to see other questions that other people had as well. And I think it kind of piggybacks on what Ellen just shared. Their question was, how do we learn to trust people again? And how do we learn to trust ourselves? Is that okay? Can
Yeah, of course. Yeah. It's a very complex question. It's not that easy, but I'm going to root it back to, I don't think I coined this, but I call them grounding thoughts. Reasonable assumptions and ideas you can base your life on. And, in reality, yes, everybody's a potential can hurt you. We all have a dark side. And you talk about a soul-searching phenomenon to happen when you're a victim of violent crime or a victim of a trauma. You question everything, your religious beliefs, what you think about other people. Are people inherently good? And based on that, those grounding thoughts, coming up with ideas that are reasonable to move forward in, because when somebody shifts from, I think people are inherently good to inherently bad from a trauma experience, it's very difficult to trust.
Yes.
Right? Because there's something called cognitive dissonance. Like once you decide what the truth is in your life, you only hear what validates your truth.
Right.
So it's a very, it's kind of grounded in cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's taking all your assumptions and ideas, breaking them down and coming up with reasonable ideas that you can move forward with, because it all comes back to intent. Like in terms of therapy, what is it that your ultimate goal is? Is your ultimate goal to be safe? Then you shouldn't trust. You shouldn't do any of that stuff. I think this whole pandemic kind of brought into that idea that there is risk in life.
Yes.
That we can't shut down forever. Like ideally, I would love to shut down everything, but that brings in how many suicides from unemployment?
Right.
Drug addiction, all that kind of stuff. So it's a lot of work with the client on figuring out what their intent is in life and kind of moving toward that direction. That you're right, acknowledging that leaving the house, you're going to be terrified some days because it is a risk. It is a risk to get out in the world and do what you need to do. Yes. It's much safer to stay at home and, make your world smaller and smaller.
And, one thing I found, Alan, is self-talk, as much as you think that might be funny, it actually reinforces the thoughts. So if you're afraid to leave the house, if you continually say, I'm going to be okay, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be okay. That little bit of self-talk does make a difference because I think it replaces that impression you have of your mind of I'm not safe with reinforcing, okay, I'm going to be fine. I'm going to be fine. I think it starts with the talk. And then eventually, as you realize through your actions that, okay, I made it to work. I'm okay. Okay, I made it through my day. I'm okay. So I think that, like, for me, it definitely helped the self-talk to kind of impress the subconscious mind. And then eventually you believe it and you start to act as though you believe it as well.
And that's why I've learned most of my stuff from clients or victims. That's so true. And that's really the basis of cognitive behavioral therapy. It makes a difference what you say to yourself.
Oh, absolutely.
It just does, and it's, the other end of it, because I work so long with victims, is they get a profound sense of gratitude that eventually comes through their lives too. Because we don't usually get to face these kind of things until we get old or we get near death. When you have a near-death experience, you begin to, at a deeper level, appreciate what you do have.
Yeah.
Because we could definitely lose sight of that. And, this is why these podcasts are great, because I think awareness is important. It's difficult. People live very busy lives. They don't take the time to think, like, if you've never been a victim of violent crime, you don't sit there too often and say, I wonder what it's like to be a victim of violent crime.
Right.
Until it happens to you or a loved one, it just, you don't think it's going to happen. Even cancer, hey, we're told, 1 in 4 people develop cancer, but it becomes very different when they tell you that a loved one or you have cancer.
Yes.
So that's why I'm kind of excited to do this with you and, continue this work.
Absolutely. Can I ask you one more question
Sure.
before we wrap up here?
Uh-huh.
So one of the things, and somebody else asked me this question as well, as family members and friends, how do they support a victim?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question.
Of course.
Yeah, that's okay though. No, I've had to face it. Everybody's had that experience where after a loved one has died and you're at the funeral, you say, geez, I'm sorry. And then there's that awkward pause and you don't really know what to do after that. Don't get too down on yourself about this isn't something you fix right away. Most people don't learn the skill of being present with somebody that's depressed or somebody that's highly anxious.
Right.
If you're a coworker that's always depressed, you tend to avoid them a little bit, right? You don't really want to be around that energy.
Yeah.
But when it's somebody that that was once very vital and active and they look so different, so forlorn, so different than they used to be, it's a shock to everybody. It's like the family has gone through it too.
Yes.
So I think acknowledging that at least is important. And I tend to give advice that's kind of direct sometimes, like it's okay to go up to the victim at some point and say, what do you need from us? Should we not talk about it? And look, this is going to be a process. This isn't like, what, I've been thinking about that. Here's the 5 ways.
Let me give you a pamphlet.
It's a process. And if you can understand it as a process and it's going to look ugly, it's worth starting, And so if you could reach out in that way and kind of start that process, and usually the victim will have a few things after a while, but and to acknowledge that, sometimes victims will say, I don't want to talk about it at all. And that's fine.
Yeah.
But at least have some kind of bridge there rather than, just sitting in that world of awkwardness.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important for family and friends to know that it's okay if you don't know what you need to do, because there are times like me, I didn't know what I needed. So I couldn't communicate anyway. So just your presence of being there was enough for me in that moment. Ellen, thank you so much for being my guest today.
Oh, you're so welcome again. And thanks again for sharing your story.
This is Jen Lee with the I Need Blue podcast. Thank you for listening today. You can listen to this story and others at www.ineedblue.net. And remember, you are stronger than you think.